Okay, so when we think about the diagnosis of schizophrenia, as I said before, it can be diagnosed according to one of two different systems. It can be diagnosed according to the International Classification of Disease system, which is developed by the World Health Organization, or it can be diagnosed according to the DSM-5, which is sort of the American handbook or Bible of psychiatric disorders. For the purposes of this course, I'll be defining it in terms of the ICD, the International Classification of Disease, version 10. But again, I want to emphasize that it's highly overlapping with the DSM-5 diagnosis. The ICD-10 diagnosis for schizophrenia consists of 9 major classes of symptoms. The first class of symptoms is thought echo, thought insertion or withdrawal, or thought broadcasting. We've already talked about several of these symptoms. Thought broadcasting, we didn't talk about that, actually involves the idea that when one is thinking, one's thoughts can be heard outside one's own sort of personal experience. So, for example, I've worked with folks who might believe that they might be in a cafe with other people, and they have this experience of thought broadcasting where they feel like what they're thinking is being heard by everyone in the coffee shop as they walk into the coffee shop. So that's an example of thought broadcasting. So again, the first class of symptoms, thought echo, thought insertion or withdrawal, and thought broadcasting. Second class of symptoms includes delusions of control, which we've already talked about. This is where you believe that your behaviors or thoughts are being controlled by an entity outside yourself. A third category of symptoms, according to the ICD-10, are hallucinatory voices giving a running commentary on your behavior. And we talked about this as well, the idea of voices giving you a command, telling you to do something, pick up a glass, put a glass down, etc. Those would be hallucinatory voices. That's class C, the third class. The fourth class are persistent delusions of other kinds that are culturally inappropriate. This might include what we describe as grandiose delusions, delusions that you are perhaps God or the son of God, the idea that you can change the weather, that you're communicating with aliens in another universe. These types of unusual ideas that usually involve some sense of having large amounts of power are examples of the persistent delusions in class D, the fourth class in the ICD-10. Class E are persistent hallucinations in any modality. So these are persistent hallucinations in auditory processing, olfactory processing, or smell, any modality. The next classification F, are breaks in the train of thought, resulting in incoherence or irrelevant speech. And this would relate to the disorganization we talked about earlier in this lecture. Catatonic behavior is class G, and catatonic behavior are things such as posturing, unusual movements, being immobile for long periods of time, having what's called waxen flexibility, where you might be frozen in one position, someone might move you to another position, and then you just stay absolutely immobile in that new position. That's known as waxen flexibility, or just a general stupor. The next category, category H of the ICD-10 classification of symptoms, are negative symptoms, which we've already talked about: apathy, avolition, alogia. We've already defined those terms. Social withdrawal, of course, is very important. And lastly, the last category is, in this category I, is a significant and consistent change in the overall quality of some aspects of personal behavior, manifest as a loss of interest, aimlessness, idleness, or a self-absorbed attitude. Given these 9 categories of symptoms, in order to merit a diagnosis, you have to have either one of these symptoms or several of these symptoms for at least a period of a month. If the symptoms are less than a month, you would have a different diagnosis. You might suspect the emergence of schizophrenia, but you wouldn't meet full criteria for it. The ICD-10 criteria are somewhat different from the DSM-5, and then in the DSM-5, one needs a 6-month period of suffering from symptoms to merit a diagnosis. In addition to these general groups of symptoms that are used to diagnose the disorder, there are also what are called subtypes of the disorder that the ICD-10 uses and refers to. And the types of subtypes that they might refer to, one subtype would be a paranoid subtype. And this is a subtype where people, or the clinical picture, is largely dominated by paranoid delusions. the idea that the CIA might be following you, the idea that perhaps your phone is tapped, your computer is being watched by someone else. So those types of paranoid delusions, that's the paranoid subtype. There's also a disorganized or hebephrenic subtype. The disorganized or hebephrenic subtype involves profound disorganization. This is the word salad, might include the word salad that we talked about before, sort of a disruption in the logical processes of thought. A third subtype might be a subtype that's primarily demonstrated through negative symptoms, right? And this is a subtype where people show a lot of avolition, social withdrawal, right? This is sort of a negative subtype of the disorder. There's also been referred to as simple schizophrenia. And what simple schizophrenia is, it's a form of schizophrenia in which there are really never florid psychotic symptoms. You don't have symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations, these sort of very striking, powerful symptoms that are very noticeable to clinicians. But instead, one might suffer from sort of a gradual decrease in one's social interaction. Over time, a person might become more and more socially withdrawn. Over time, they may be less likely to interact with others. They may become more and more mute over time. It tends to have an insidious onset, a gradual onset, and progresses over many, many years. And at no time, again, do you have those florid symptoms, and that's known as simple schizophrenia. There's also a mixed subtype, and this is often, in some studies, this has been indicated to be the most commonly diagnosed subtype. And in the mixed subtype, you have elements of the different subtypes that we've talked about, right? You might have paranoid symptoms, you might have disorganized symptoms, you might have negative symptoms. So it's a mix of these different subtypes. So another feature of schizophrenia that is not involved in the diagnosis of the disorder, but over the last 20 years has really come to be recognized as a key element of the disorder, are cognitive deficits. Evidence suggests that cognitive difficulties, which represent difficulties in attention, in memory, in problem solving, lead to more difficulties in everyday life for people with schizophrenia than positive symptoms, which are most often used to diagnose the disorder. People with these deficits in cognition may have trouble understanding or remembering what people say, finishing a job or chore, or remembering to do things. People with schizophrenia, many people with schizophrenia have these difficulties in cognition, and current estimates suggest that if you take into account sort of baseline cognitive functioning, so the idea that you're taking in what people's sort of intellectual capacity is, if you account for that, just about everyone with schizophrenia has some decrement in their cognitive skills. So if we take a look at this diagram of people with schizophrenia, and if you look on the X or bottom axis, those are areas of cognition. They include abstraction, attention, verbal memory, spatial memory, language, spatial ability, sensory ability, and motor ability. You can see that people with schizophrenia have deficits across all those areas of cognition. So all those different cognitive skills, people with schizophrenia on a mean basis in groups show deficits on these tests relative to healthy controls. So this does in fact suggest that cognitive deficits are very common in the disorder, and they affect a wide range of different cognitive functions. The other thing that's important to see from this diagram is if you look at the dotted line in fact looks at people with schizophrenia, the same people with schizophrenia assessed about a year and a half later. These folks have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, they've been treated with oral antipsychotic medication, and yet as you can see, the cognitive deficits are almost identical to what you see at initial assessment, suggesting not only that there are these fairly profound cognitive deficits across a wide array of areas, but in addition, treatment of the symptoms of schizophrenia with contemporary psychopharmacologic interventions don't seem to have an impact on the nature of the cognitive difficulties even a year and a half later. So the cognitive difficulties seem to be relatively resistant to the effects of antipsychotic medication. So these cognitive difficulties have really in many ways been a new line of treatment in our understanding of the disorder and are an important new target for novel treatments.